May 1945, a military occupation rationing center in a shattered German city. Freezing wind sweeps through the hollowed shell of a ruined brick warehouse. Hundreds of thin, shivering German women and children stand in a silent, agonizing line that stretches down the muddy street, clutching empty cloth sacks. They wait for hours just to receive a few measured ounces of coarse flour and stale bread from the American military government. Suddenly, the fragile piece of the food line shatters. A group of captured, paroled Wehrmacht officers pushes violently through the crowd, shoving weeping mothers and small children into the mud. They stride directly to the front, slamming a leather riding crop onto the wooden distribution table and loudly demanding the premium canned meat and coffee meant for the occupation forces. But General George Patton will soon establish a brutal, unforgettable form of justice that turns their unearned arrogance completely against them. This is the story of how General George Patton shattered the entitlement of defeated German officers who tried to steal food from their own starving people. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. Supply Sergeant Frank Pops Kelly was 42 years old, born and raised in the hard-working neighborhoods of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. Before the draft board called his number, he spent his life baking bread in his family's small brick bakery, waking up at 4 every morning to mix yeast and flour. He was a quiet father of 3 young children, a man who understood exactly what it took to keep a community fed. When the war began, he left his bakery and joined the 70th Infantry Division, eventually finding himself assigned to the occupation logistics teams in central Germany. He had survived the freezing, terrifying combat of the winter, but the sight of emaciated children crying for a single crust of bread affected him far worse than the artillery shells. He spent his days meticulously weighing out rations down to the precise fraction of an ounce, ensuring that every weeping mother received her exact share. On this freezing morning, he stood behind the wooden distribution table, determined to protect the small heap of food from anyone who tried to take more than their fair share. Oberst Werner von Falk was 48 years old, an aristocratic Wehrmacht officer from an old, wealthy Prussian family with a military lineage dating back 4 centuries. He had spent the war commanding troops on the Eastern Front, living in comfortable headquarters far behind the firing lines while his men died in the mud. Even as a paroled prisoner in a ruined city, he maintained an unyielding, haughty pride, wearing a perfectly tailored wool uniform and tall leather boots that shone like glass. He wore his Iron Cross proudly on his chest and constantly carried a silver-tipped leather riding crop, which he used to clear people from his path. He viewed the starving civilian population behind him as a weak, useless burden on the state, a peasantry that existed only to serve the military class. In his mind, total defeat changed absolutely nothing about his place in the social order. He firmly believed that a commissioned officer possessed a fundamental, permanent right to the finest supplies available, regardless of who starved in the process. By May 1945, the European continent was a vast landscape of smoking ruins, shattered infrastructure, and profound human misery. The Third Reich had collapsed completely, leaving behind a governing vacuum filled only by Allied military occupation forces. Cities across Germany were choked with millions of homeless refugees, displaced persons, and demobilized soldiers wandering through the debris. The transportation networks were entirely destroyed, with bombed-out rail yards and severed bridges halting the flow of basic commodities. Food production had completely stopped in many regions, plunging the civilian population into the immediate peril of mass starvation. The Allies faced the monumental task of establishing emergency rationing centers to keep populations alive, operating under strict guidelines to prevent disease and total societal collapse. In this chaotic environment, the traditional social structures of Germany had completely dissolved, yet many military officers struggled to accept their loss of status. Some local American commanders had allowed paroled Wehrmacht officers to maintain small privileges, wanting to avoid unrest or administrative trouble in the crowded holding areas. These tactical compromises created a dangerous sense of immunity among the defeated leadership class, who still expected deference from the very people they had led into total destruction. This growing friction between old military entitlement and the desperate reality of survival created volatile flashpoints across the entire occupation zone. The fragile order of these crowded distribution centers relied entirely on the discipline of individual soldiers managing the chaos. Back inside the freezing warehouse, that discipline was about to be tested to its absolute limit as the line began to ripple with anger. Oberst von Falk marched to the front of the line and slammed his leather riding crop onto the wooden table, causing the small pile of flour sacks to shake. He looked at the American soldier with absolute disdain. "I am Oberst Werner von Falk," he said. "My officers and I require our rations immediately." Sergeant Kelly did not move from his spot behind the scale. "Get in the back of the line, buddy," he said. "Everyone waits their turn here." The German officer stepped closer, his chest puffed out so the iron cross catched the dull light. "You do not understand your position, Sergeant," he said. "We are commissioned officers of the Wehrmacht." "I don't care if you're the King of Siam," Kelly answered, his voice flat. "These women and kids have been standing in the freezing cold since dawn. Walk your boots to the back." Von Falk thumped his riding crop against his tall leather boot, the sound sharp like a pistol shot in the quiet warehouse. "We do not eat the food of the civilian peasantry," he shouted. "We demand the premium canned meat and the coffee from your military stores. It is our fundamental right under our military status to be fed before these useless people." Kelly looked down at the table, then looked straight into the officer's eyes. "You don't have rights here, Colonel," he said. "You have a ration card, or you have nothing. Now move before I move you." The colonel leaned over the table, his face turning red with rage. "You are a common baker, a low-born conscript," he hissed. "You have no right to deny a Prussian officer. These peasants behind me are nothing but a burden on the state. And we will not starve while they receive food." Kelly stood up to his full height, physically blocking the table with his chest. He could see the small children in the front of the line, trembling with fear, clutching their mothers' coats. "I'm the guy with the scoop," Kelly said, "and you're just another prisoner." Von Falk turned to his fellow officers, gesturing wildly toward the line. "This is an insult to the entire German army," he screamed. "We will not be treated like common beggars by a dirty shopkeeper." The shouting grew so loud that the guards at the door took their rifles off their shoulders. Kelly realized this situation was spinning completely out of his control. He signaled to a nearby corporal. "Get the lieutenant down here, right now," Kelly said. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top command jeep skidded to a halt on the wet cobblestones just outside the brick warehouse, the tires kicking up a spray of muddy water. 4 polished silver stars glinted on the front of his helmet, and the handles of his twin ivory-handled revolvers rested against his hips. The general stepped out of the vehicle and walked into the distribution center completely unannounced, his boots striking the floor with rhythmic precision. The entire room went dead silent, the shouting cutting off instantly as every American soldier snapped to a rigid salute. The starving German women and children shrank back against the damp brick walls, watching the towering American commander with wide, terrified eyes. Patton did not raise his voice. He walked directly up to the wooden distribution table, stood beside Sergeant Kelly, and looked coldly at the German colonel. "What seems to be the trouble here, Colonel?" Patton asked. Oberst von Falk straightened his wool uniform and adjusted his iron cross, thinking he had finally found a fellow officer who would respect his position. "General, these common soldiers are refusing to grant my men our proper rations," the colonel said. "They expect us to stand in the mud with the peasantry and wait for scraps of flour. We are commissioned officers of the Wehrmacht, and we demand the premium meat and coffee that our status requires." Patton studied the German's immaculate uniform, his polished boots, and the silver-tipped riding crop still resting on the table. "You believe your rank gives you a permanent privilege," Patton said. "Yes, General. It is the law of the military hierarchy," von Falk answered. Patton nodded slowly, his eyes narrowing into cold slits. "You come into this house of misery and demand the finest food while your own people starve behind you," Patton said. "You stand here in a tailored coat, holding a toy whip, and talk about the rights of a Prussian officer. Let me tell you something about your status, Colonel. You lost the war. Your army is completely destroyed. Your government is gone, and your country is a pile of smoking rubble. You do not dictate the menu to the men who beat you. This sergeant spent his winter freezing in a foxhole while you sat in a warm headquarters eating beef. He is a father, he is a baker, and he knows more about duty than you ever will. You have two options right now. You can take your place at the absolute back of this line and wait for your turn like a common beggar. Or you can face immediate military justice for inciting a riot in an active occupation zone. Decide in the next 5 seconds. The German colonel stared at the general, his mouth opening slightly as his aristocratic pride completely crumbled under the weight of Patton's gaze. He looked at his fellow officers, then looked down at his polished boots. Remaining entirely silent, Patton turned sharply to the waiting squad of American military police. "Strip them," the general commanded, his voice slicing through the chilled warehouse air. The military police moved forward instantly, their heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. They physically grabbed Oberst von Falk and his subordinate officers, ignoring their gasps of indignation. With rough, practiced movements, the guards tore the bright silver and gold epaulets right off the shoulders of the tailored wool uniforms, leaving the threads frayed and ruined. They ripped the Iron Cross medals from the officers' chests and snatched the silver-tipped leather riding crops out of their hands, tossing the status symbols carelessly onto the dirty wooden distribution table. The starving German women and children in the long queue watched in stunned silence, some whispering quickly to one another as they saw their former, all-powerful protectors brought entirely to nothing. Patton then pointed a gloved finger toward the very back of the freezing street. "March these men to the absolute rear of the line," Patton ordered, but the punishment did not stop there. The general decreed right then that for the next 30 days, these proud officers would receive exactly half the caloric ration of the civilians they had tried to push aside. Furthermore, they were ordered to personally sweep the mud and horse manure from the cobblestone streets every single morning, before they would be allowed to receive their meager scraps of food. Sergeant Frank Kelly returned to Philadelphia in late 1945, his chest unburdened by the weight of the theater, but his mind forever anchored to the desperate faces in that distribution warehouse. He reopened his family bakery on the corner of 2nd Street, where the warm aroma of fresh yeast and flour served as a daily shield against the grim memories of the European occupation. He lived a quiet, unassuming life as a dedicated father, never boasting about his wartime service or his brief encounter with the legendary 4-star general. He passed away peacefully surrounded by his children and grandchildren in 1982. Oberst Werner von Falk spent 3 years in a regional Allied denazification and labor camp, where his hands, once accustomed only to polished leather and silver pens, grew thick and calloused from heavy manual labor. Upon his release in 1948, he returned to a completely transformed Germany, finding his family estate reduced to a communal farming plot under the new administration. He spent his remaining decades working as a low-level clerk in a Munich transit office, an embittered, silent man who remained intensely resentful of the day his Reichskriegsdienst privileges were stripped away on a public street. He died in obscurity in 1974, never forgiving the American military government. General George Patton rarely mentioned the incident in his official correspondence, treating the confrontation as a routine administrative correction rather than a historic event. However, he did describe the encounter in a private handwritten letter to his wife, noting that true leadership requires protecting the helpless from the very institutions that claim to defend them. He wrote that an officer who expects to eat while his people starve is not a soldier, but a parasite. Some historians have argued that General Patton's public humiliation of the paroled Wehrmacht officers went too far, bypassing standard military legal protocols and violating the professional courtesies traditionally extended to defeated leadership. They suggest that such extreme measures risked inciting local unrest among a population that still held residual respect for the old military hierarchy. Others have argued the exact opposite, maintaining that a swift, highly visible destruction of unearned privilege was absolutely essential to break the backbone of Prussian militarism. They believed that by forcing the aristocratic officers to share the exact hardships of the peasantry, Patton prevented a dangerous resurgence of nationalist arrogance. What is certain is that the distribution center remained completely orderly for the remainder of the occupation, establishing a definitive precedent that old status offered no protection against the new realities of the post-war world. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have stripped those arrogant officers on the spot, or would you have chosen a softer alternative to avoid administrative trouble? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more stories about what happened when old hierarchies met new realities, make sure to subscribe.